faith with the church and see Israel really as not just a piece of the puzzle, but a very key piece of the puzzle in the end times. There's something called Jewish giftedness and world redemption. Jewish people collectively coming into their destiny, their election, and how that will have a reverberating effect on the whole world. And so, as we said sometimes when we talk to some local pastors, I find it interesting, well, not surprising, but very few, I think, if not any at all, have a missionary methodology for the Jewish people in Pittsburgh. So, and that's not where I think you're getting, and I don't mean to badmouth pastors. I think pastors are wonderful. I mean, they sacrifice their lives for the Lord. But the idea is, why would we invest in a people group that makes up less than 1% of the world's population? Wouldn't our missionary dollars be better used going to larger people groups? But that's not how God thinks. Because when you invest in Israel, you really do invest in the world. And the prophets speak of a time very optimistically, and very optimistic. These prophets are very optimistic, not like the dispensational end time scheme where the whole world, goes to hell just before they bow the knee. The Jewish prophets are very optimistic about the last days, but it all depends on Israel coming into her own election, coming into their own destiny and calling from God. When that happens, it says that the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the seabeds. That's optimistic. That's saying that last generation before Yeshua comes, I mean, en masse the nations are going to be coming into salvation. So it's a great thing. And but anyway, this course began very kind of grassroots, very one class at a time, and where we go from here. But over time, we kind of developed a system. And what I want to do today is just continue with this idea of Jewish perspective on the last days, a framework for understanding the Gospels. And if you recall, the last time, I'll try to put this back here. The last time we were together, we said that when you come to the New Testament, the whole orientation, the whole framework of the Gospels was a surprise. We have to understand, put ourselves back into that picture, right? And this was completely unanticipated in first century Judaism, in the Jewish mind. I mean, so we were saying that all the hopes, all the aspirations, all the dreams of that first century Jewish mindset, were dashed to pieces. I mean, we were saying earlier, even Yochanan, right? John the Baptist was in prison. And he's second guessing the fact that the kingdom is going to come, because with all the miracles that Yeshua had done, the Romans were still marching through the streets of Jerusalem and still forcing Jews to carry their bags. They were schlepping bags, right? They were schleppers. That's a good thing. I mean, being a schlepper, I schlepped for an older Jewish man years ago, Reverend Jack Levin. I was a brand new believer, and he taught me a lot of things. But my job was to schlep his bags. But I did it willingly. These guys are not doing it willingly. But so John, John had a kind of a Daniel 2 kind of Isaiah 2, Isaiah 11 concept of the coming of the Messiah. And we were saying earlier too that the extent to which we must see the extent to which Israel was really conditioned to see the Messiah solely within a political framework of that century. The Rome ruling over Israel was the perfect storm for God to come back and put them over the top and see them through. So the harsh conditions of life under Roman rule really, in a sense, yet further emphasized the political role of the Messiah and diminished the atoning role of Messiah. So I don't, as I said earlier, Israel did a lot of things wrong. But, we have to understand that the things that they embraced and did right. I mean, we said, do you think that Yeshua would have been any better received had he gone to the Romans or the Assyrians or the people of the Far East? No. I mean, Israel was, was still the receptacle. How much God invested in time and energy into this people group to rightly receive Him, although however they to the extent that they were conditioned to see Him solely within that political framework and to the diminish of the other was a problem. But I think if you were there or I were there, we might have responded the same way. So that's where I began. The fact that first century Judaism, what happened in the New Testament was a surprise. All the hopes were dashed. All their aspirations were filled with this concept we call the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a confluence of events, in a sense, each causing the other to happen. It's a season of time that we say begins with judgment and ends with salvation. Those are the two key things. It begins with judgment and ends with salvation. And so, but the fact that Israel at the time was being crushed under this iron heel of Rome provided the perfect storm, the perfect scenario for that day to really come with its judgment on the nations and, of course, judgment on Israel to an extent, but ultimately out of that coming salvation, all of Israel being saved and the nations responding to that and basking in that light and ended up getting saved themselves. So they had what we call at that time an apocalyptic consciousness. Their minds were saturated with, with Him coming back and that God was going to deliver them. And not only were their minds saturated with this idea deliverance, but even with this new idea within Judaism and Jewish minds and consciousness that began at that time, and it is this: how can we help? How can we, in a sense, hasten, and how can we bring about the coming of the day of the Lord speedily? And this idea began to grow in Jewish minds during the first century more and more. The one thing that was completely unanticipated in first century Jewish minds was this idea of which they didn't anticipate, was this mystery we call the transition. That God was going to call out multitudes, hundreds, thousands, millions of those from the nations before, we say in Hebrew, lifnei, right? Before all of Israel is saved. And so this is, I know when Sam was sharing this morning, one of the things that differentiates us from all traditional shuls or synagogues, well, basically three things: the centrality of Yeshua in our worship. Number two, the primary place of the New Covenant scriptures in our preaching and in our teaching. And finally, the fact that the people of God are now defined as Jew and Gentile without those from the nations first becoming Jewish. That was revolutionary. That was unanticipated, this whole transition. And that's why I say the New Testament, if you can just step back and recognize that the New Testament was essentially written for two reasons. One, to reveal the coming of this individual called Yeshua, the Messiah, but also to deal with this transition. So you find that much of Paul's letters are dealing with this relationship of Jew and Gentile and the proper relationship that flows between the two now. This caused a lot of jealousy. You see that in the book of Acts, the Pharisees, from the school of Shammai, were becoming increasingly jealous over Paul's success. Paul was having tremendous success, not right away. Remember, the first 10 chapters of the book of Acts, you're not even dealing with the Gentiles or the nations. It's all Jewish. Those guys had no idea. They were ensconced in their own eschatology. God had to break in and tell them, hey, look, Peter, do you think it might be a good idea if we get the Gentiles saved too? To which Peter probably would have said, if I was back, no, why would we want to do that? We'll get Israel saved, and then we'll worry about the Gentiles. Let's just get us saved first, and when they come into their election, then the nations will come to the light. But God had to break into that eschatology and show that, no, this is not my plan. This is not my way, and God had His reasons for that. We said from a very practical standpoint, they estimate about 2 million Jewish people population in Jerusalem in the first century and about 5 million in the diaspora. And we hypothetically we said, what would have happened if 7 million Jewish people embraced their Messiah? And Isaiah was wrong when he said, "Who has believed our message?" They all believed it. Just in this hypothetical scenario, what would have happened? Practically speaking, it would have forced the nations out because of the Judaizing effect and the predominancy of the Jewish legalistic approach, telling Gentiles, even after Paul's message, dogging Paul's steps and saying, no, it's not, you don't need just Yeshua, you also need to become Jewish. You need to embrace a Jewish lifestyle. But I'm just saying, from a practical, just a human standpoint, one of the reasons why God did it his way and not all of Israel coming to faith at once, because it would not have allowed, from a human standpoint, the nations coming in mass, and they really did. Although I don't use the word en masse lightly, because all we are is a remnant today. The church is just a remnant of those from the nations and a remnant from Israel. So that's not the good news. Is that when you get to the end of days, the prophets speak of nations coming in mass and Israel coming in. So anyway, that's where we did. So this idea, they didn't anticipate this age of transition. So we wanted to back up a little bit, and we said that throughout the centuries, as Jews began to meditate on the Torah, they began to look at this. They slowly began to realize something. And you find this like reading between the lines, because there was always a saved remnant. There was always a righteous remnant. You can trace it through the prophets. And so they began to meditate on the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah. And as they did that, they progressively began to realize this, is that they were to be the instruments of the nations coming to the knowledge of God. Okay, now that was part and parcel of their call. Sam mentioned the wedding betrothal, where God married Israel, Exodus chapter 20, is it 19? Yeah, 19. God enters into a betrothal, a marriage covenant. And God doesn't just lead Israel out of Egypt. He leads them out, and he gives them a purpose. He gives them a call. And they were to be a light to the nations. And so they began to lose sight of that. But as you get into the prophets, they begin to recognize and understand slowly that they were to be, their calling, their job description was to be as the instrument of the nations coming to the knowledge of God. Now, the fact that Yeshua came 2,000 years ago didn't do away with that job description. Israel will yet be in that place. It only really confirmed it because he was the Messiah that came to actually fill them with his own life and cause them now to go out into the nations as a witness. But they slowly began to realize this, that we really are to be the instrument of the nations coming to the knowledge of God. And because of that, we said that those who were faithful in the nation began to look upon those who were unfaithful in the nation, which you understand was the greater part of the nation, right? And they began to look at those unfaithful in the nation, and they began to see them as an obstacle to what God really wanted to do. This obstacle to what God really wanted to do and fulfill within the Jewish call to be an instrument of the nations coming. And so the role of the prophets really was what? We were talking about this earlier. The role of the prophets essentially was not to predict, but to call the people back to covenant faithfulness, to call the people back into alignment with these faithful few. And so I was like, when you jump over to the New Testament, Yeshua talks about the road to heaven is great. There be many enter that way, but the road to heaven is narrow. He's talking about that remnant, that you see that remnant like there's a thread all the way through the Hebrew scriptures and then right up into the New Covenant. So the role of the prophets was to bring this greater part of Israel, the greater part of the nation, back into alignment with these faithful few. And we said that there were two events in ancient history that seemed to be crushing blows and tremendous obstacles to Israel fulfilling their call to be the instrument. And we said it's not, they're not that easy to get. I mean, but if you think about it, they were the both captivities. They were the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, right? And the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities really became the basis, really the foundation for all future biblical prophecy. So the prophet was always looking at his immediate situation, but out of that, his message had relevance to all future generations. You see, so that was what was going on. These captivities now provided the foundation and the basis for these prophets to speak into the people, to speak into that immediate situation, but also had relevance to all future generations. And so you see, as the prophets are speaking, and it is out of these crushing blows, these tremendous obstacles to Israel fulfilling her call, which were the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, that we have this concept now that we talk of as the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord, and this concept we call the day of the Lord now begins to be kind of developed in Scripture as the prophets, use this phrase, and it's an interesting thing. If you go through the Scriptures, I was just underlying in Zechariah, I think it's chapter 14 alone. There's something like 20 references to. And it's not just the day of the Lord. It can be said as that day or in that day, on that day. That's this period of time we call the day of the Lord, right? And it's out of these crushing blows with these captivities that we now have this concept that begins to appear. And it not only begins to appear, but the prophets begin to develop this thing. And the day of the Lord, of course, appears to be an extended period of time, beginning with judgment, ending with salvation and the coming of the Messiah. And as this concept began to develop more and more in the prophets, like Joel, which is one of the first of the prophets, predates, and Isaiah, as this concept begins to be of the day of the Lord begins to be developed, this becomes kind of like the intervention and in judgment and in salvation for Israel. It's out of this idea, this concept. So the day of the Lord brings judgment and salvation together and provides an opportunity for those who now were unfaithful to repent. So what I want to do is I just want to look at something. I did a little bit more homework between last time we were here, and I want to break it down this way before I share some of the verses here. We'll look at not a whole lot today, but some, a summary of the prophetic hope. So this is kind of a summary. We find so number one, when we think about this concept of the day of the Lord comes, it is a day of awesome judgment and deliverance. Number two, Israel is not, let off the hook. Right? God's going to chastise Israel. God's going to discipline Israel. Israel is judged, but ultimately vindicated of her sins, according to the prophets, and fulfills her purpose as an instrument of the nations coming to the knowledge of God. That's number two. Number three, Israel has this mighty deliverance, this awesome deliverance in the last days as a result of God's judgment on the nations. Joel tells us that. Joel tells us that one of the reasons for the tribulation in the end time is because of the way the nations have treated Israel for 2,000 years. By the way, I just want to we talked about this last time. The idea of the tribulation is scary, I mean, how we entered into the tribulation. And of course, this is not a New Testament idea. It's described as trouble. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the time of Jacob's trouble, we find that in Jeremiah 30, Daniel chapter 12. It's nothing new, and I want to just give you we did this last time, that the tribulation period, or what you would want to call it, is basically for three reasons. Number one, it has to do with the clash between the forces of darkness and the kingdom of light. It has to be. as the end days start to, as we get closer and closer to his second coming, there has to be, and there's always been, a clash between the forces of darkness and the kingdom of light. We said, for every kingdom advanced, there's a counter move by hell's forces. You know it in your life, not if you're lazy and sitting around all day and not doing anything for the Lord, but you know it in your life if you're serious about your faith and you're verbalizing and you're sharing it and you're doing things. You know that. So there's nothing new. When we think of the tribulation period, this is just something that has to be. Number one, it just has to do with the clash between the kingdom of darkness and the children of light. Number two, the tribulation has to take place because God has to judge sin, right? I mean, back in Egypt, God was judging the sin of Egypt and Pharaoh. Sin has to be judged, and God will judge it. And when he judges it, there was some in Egypt, even part of Pharaoh's cabinet, that said, "Don't you see what's happening?" And they went on to the Israel side. So Sam mentioned this today, that when something happens, people either respond two different ways. They either get closer to the Lord or further away. So number two, the tribulation period will be basically God has to judge sin. And finally, the third reason for the tribulation is simply because God is going to purify his bride. He's going to melt all that dross. He's going to give us new orientations through the Holy Spirit to things that have separated us for years and centuries. And he's going to bring that bride into that place of unity and maturity and holiness. And he's going to do that through the persecution of saints, unfortunately. I mean, it's just the way it is. I've always said that I've grown more through hard times than good times. It's the sorrows in life and the things those are the things that really you look back at that were pivotal points and really just changed you and grew you up. So just keep that in mind for those three reasons. The clash of forces between darkness has to be. And remember, Satan, we said jokingly last time, it's not like Satan says, in the book of Revelation, I think this is a really good time to kind of come out and do all this stuff. No, that's not what's happening. Is that we, the body of Messiah, it's all synergistic. We're growing in love and maturity, and in a sense, we smoke him out. He's got to come out. He has no choice. And that's those three reasons. So the clash of forces, God's judgment, and hoping end in repentance and not getting harder. And finally, God is going to use that to bring his bride to this place where they're chaste and he can come back now. So let's just continue. So the summary: the day of the Lord comes. It's an awesome judgment and deliverance. Israel's judged, but they're vindicated because God is moving within them. They fulfill that purpose as the instrument of the nations coming. Number three, Israel has this mighty deliverance in the last days as a result of God's judgment on the nations. Because we said part of the reason for the judgment on the nations is the way the nations have treated God's people throughout the centuries. Number four, we see that in Joel. Number four, Israel's deliverance is so massive, so awesome, so deliverance through the direct intervention. It's amazing. I mean, you think the Exodus was something. Wait until you get to this part in history. The direct intervention of God, that the nations come to the light of God and are converted en masse. Okay? It's not the dispensational scheme where just before we bow the knee, we're forced to bow the knee. By the way, that section in Philippians has its roots in Isaiah 45, and it's very optimistic. It's not that the nations bow the knee and just before God casts them into hell, they confess Jesus. That's not what's going on there. But the nations are converted en masse. And finally, the new covenant whereby the law will be written upon the hearts of the people will be universally applied. God's people will be moved to obey his statutes and judgments. And so the law is now internalized. And that's why we can say that the fullness of the new covenant is not here yet. We know that if you read the principal text in all of the Hebrew Bible about the new covenant, which is Jeremiah 31, of course Ezekiel 36 too, but Jeremiah 31 is the key principal passage. And if you keep reading that, you'll see that what you see is that every individual will know God. So this is talking about intimate relationship. The fullness of the new covenant comes when all of Israel has this intimate relationship with God. So okay, so that's let's just I'll close with this. So the biblical prophetic hope then is that with the coming of the day of the Lord and the coming return of Yeshua, that despite the awesome judgments and despite all the death, and it's not, I'm saying I'm sugarcoating this thing, and despite the lostness of the people who are judged, that this leads ultimately to the salvation of Israel and the conversion of the nations in mass. So let's just pause there for a second before we go on. Is there any just comments, insights? Because we're all kind of growing in this kind of thing. It's foundational stuff. Anything before we put up the next?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure. I can try.
Okay, great. When you're first starting with the, I think you said, I can't remember if you said Isaiah 2, when you're talking about the mindset they had of what Yeshua would look like.
Right. The Daniel 2.
Was it talking about, like, when you say that, are you referencing, like, he'd be like a winnowing fork? Is that the passage you're talking about? When John the Baptist was essentially...
No, I was talking, I think is it Matthew 11? I can't remember, where he's in prison.
Yes.
And and he sends his disciples to Yeshua. And he says, are you the one that's going to come, or should we look for another? And he says, and Yeshua says, well, go tell John what you see. The blind see, the lame walk, the poor have the gospel preached. Blessed is he who is not offended in me. Yeah. So I'm paraphrasing that by saying, blessed is he who is not offended by the form of the kingdom that I brought, which is not the form in its fullness, but it's what we call an already not yet kingdom. George Ladd, in his great book, that Dan Juster talks about George Ladd. I think he's deceased since, but he wrote a wonderful book on the day of the Lord, and he knocks this home. But I would recommend anything with George Ladd. But yeah, that's what was going on. So John and a lot of the people, they were not only did they have their own programs on how to bring the Messiah back, I mean, they were like the form of the kingdom that Yeshua brought was unanticipated. It was a surprise. That's why you ask Jewish people today, why don't you believe in Jesus the Messiah? Well, if Jesus is the Messiah, why is the world in such a mess? And we said jokingly that, well, it may be a mess over there in that life, but it's not a mess over there in this life. Because you see, the kingdom of God was as gentle as throwing seed. It can in a filled room, it could hit this person and miss that person, or it could hit everyone. But depending on the soil of the heart, that seed doesn't germinate. It doesn't produce. So that's the form. The form of the kingdom that Yeshua brought is not an irresistible form. People can resist it. People resisted even. I mean, I think that the early disciples never imagined that the Jewish leadership would continue to reject Yeshua after he had risen from the grave. I mean, the resurrection was as fresh as the morning newspaper. I mean, people were falling over in Peter's shadow. I mean, what in the world? How much more can we do? And yet, in the sovereignty of God, the leadership of Israel resisted that, and did so in the sovereignty of God, because this opened the floodgates of the nations coming into that place, and that was revolutionary. There's no second-class status anymore. There was like 4th and 5th class status under the older covenant. I mean, but there's only first-class status today, and God is into distinction. God likes distinction. God created distinction for the purpose of mutual blessing, not mutual rejection. He wants the nations to have a DNA of the nations. He wants the Jewish people to have a Jewish DNA. He wants that because that's how blessing flows. Remember we said that why this culture is in such trouble, serious trouble today, because we are erasing distinctions. And the primary one is male and female. And when you erase distinctions between male and female, you have chaos. Because the first chapter of the book of Bereshit, the Genesis, in the Bible, in the Torah, God is talking about distinctions. And he's busy separating things. Light from darkness, Israel from the nations, land from sea, heaven and earth, light and darkness. it just over and over, and that distinction was created by God. And you start to erase those things, and you can't have anything but chaos. God, out of a chaotic world, God began the business of Havdalah, right? God was celebrating Havdalah, right? He was separating things. Bang, bing, bang. Everything was separated. We are at a very dangerous time in our culture today because we're not respecting this kinds of thing that God. So okay, so if there's no, I'll just put on a couple of things. This is it in a nutshell. If you want to just break it down to 1, 2, 3, the day of the Lord comes out of the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. A new concept emerged called the day of the Lord, where the prophet was talking to the immediate situation, and yet all had relevance to all future generations. The day of the Lord comes. It's a day of awesome judgment and a day of awesome deliverance for Israel. This leads to the conversion of the nations. Or, in parentheses here, the biblical prophetic hope then is that with the coming of the day of the Lord, despite the awesome judgments and death and the lostness of the peoples who are judged, that this leads ultimately to the salvation of Israel and the conversion of the nations in mass. So let's just real quick, we'll just look at just a few. There's so many to look at, but I looked at here, and you can kind of see in this here, look at a few passages in the prophets that give us an understanding of the themes of the last days. The prophets are prophesying during the time of both captivities, yet in the midst of this terrible disaster, they're also prophesying about the great hope for Israel and the nation. So now it will come about in the last days. So this is the day of the Lord. This is that day, the last days, that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. And remember, Israel, we're talking about the word mountains. It means a lot of things. It means the government of God, the law of God. I mean, the purposes of God. Lord, in the Lord's Prayer, that will be done on heaven and on earth. God is going to bring his purpose, his law, his justice back to this earth. So it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. So Israel is going to come into that destiny, into the purposes of God, right? They'll have the law internalized, which is another way of saying, I'm going to give you a heart to obey me. That's what the new covenant is all about. Primary difference between the old covenant and the new covenant is simply the new covenant comes with power. The new covenant comes with enabling power to obey. That's a progressive thing, right? So Israel will be the capital of the earth. It'll be the chief of the mountains, the chief of the governments of the earth, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And we do that we were talking about when Dan was talking about the Torah being foundational. We see that when we say ki mitzion tetzei Torah, from Zion will go forth the Torah. So as the Torah is processed, everybody pivots, everybody turns, all our focus, all our energy, all our attention now is focused on that, and so we enact that day out. It's kind of like I said, like an acted out sermon. We act out that day when the living Torah will be in our midst, and all the nations will stream to it. Everything will be pointing to it, but this is only made possible again because Israel has taken up that call to be the instrument of the nations coming to the knowledge of God. So Israel becomes the instrument of the nations. So, and many peoples will say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And it says just a couple of more. So you can see nations are streaming to it. It'll come about in that day. There's the day of that day again. That not that one day, but that season of time, that confluence of time when these things will happen synergistically. In that day, that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse. Of course, that's Yeshua, David's greater son, who will stand as a standard for a signal for the peoples. People will focus on it. They'll be attracted to it. And his resting place will be glorious. Then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people. This is the great diaspora here. and he will lift up the standard for the nations and assemble the banished ones of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And then here, you can see this here, and it will come about after that in Joel, that I will pour out my spirit on all mankind, so all flesh. Now, we've had a taste of that, right? We've had a taste of that. We see that in Acts chapter 2, right? But this is the kingdom in its fullness, right? The sun will be turned into darkness. There's the judgment part, right? Remember, judgment precedes salvation. So there's the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon into blood. We don't know if we take that literally. I mean, it's hard to like take some of this stuff. Before the great and terrible day of the Lord. There it is again. And it will come about that whoever calls upon. So there's the salvation part. There's the judgment part. There's the salvation part. That's what we think about. And it will come about that whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be delivered. So that's pointing to Romans 10, right? Paul talks. For behold, in those days and at that time when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, and it will come about in that day that the mountains will drip with sweet wine and the hills will flow with milk. So just a couple of a few verses, and there's so many to choose from that talk about this thing we call the day of the Lord. When you think about how massive the oceans are, I think they say it's like 71% of the earth is covered with water. But the oceans, you think of God as the creator. So I was thinking, became to greater understanding recently that when this big thing about the clean earth and ecology today, and how we breathe in oxygen as human beings and we exhale carbon dioxide, right? And so this is a big problem with the global warming and all this stuff. So I'm not going to get into that whether that's right or wrong, but the point is that think of what God has done though, because the rainforests, the biggest one I think is in South America, right? In the Amazon, God creates this like ecology system where it's just the opposite. So plants breathe in carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. It's just like the opposite, right? And the oceans too. The oceans are huge. I mean, think of the types of plants that are floating all throughout the oceans. It's the same thing. It's the opposite of us. So it's taking in carbon dioxide and it's giving out oxygen. But I don't know, we just got off on a tangent. But the point is God knows what He's doing, right? So it's important that we respect the earth. We don't worship the earth, right? There's people that worship the earth because this revisiting of pantheism today, where the earth is kind of like the most important thing. We got to do anything, and if you do anything to hurt the earth, you be killed, and justifiably so. So we've gone back into this whole idea of a pantheistic religion. There's nothing new under the sun. Mother Earth, people worship the earth. People worship the animals, and people would rather see a squirrel live sometimes than a baby. I mean, it's just the way of the world. But nothing new, God knew all this stuff, and all this stuff came before. But when you think of how massive the oceans are, and how pervasive the knowledge of God will be in that day, and this is not intellectual information. This is relational intimacy. If you go again to Jeremiah chapter 31, the principal text about the new covenant. If you read through that, it talks about everybody having this knowledge of God, and so we haven't come into, this is the principal new covenant passage. So we haven't come into the fullness of what the new covenant is yet. So the earth will be full of this knowledge, and I think that's so. Let's just pivot for a second. And we'll just move on. I want to kind of jump over to the New Testament a little bit. But just as a basic summary of the prophetic hope, what we find, basic summary of what we find in the Jewish prophets in the Old Testament. They all had this general summary of the prophetic hope. When we come to the first century and the Gospels, we come into a context that is, what we said was very surprising, right? Where we find that these particular hopes and aspirations of the day of the Lord is really widespread. And that's what they're thinking of. They're thinking of how disillusioning it was, imagine, to see Yeshua on a cross. And these guys were thinking, wait a minute, we thought that this was the time when the government of God would take over the world, and the Romans, and they will, and can imagine how disillusioning that was. All their hopes, all their aspirations were dashed. They had this idea, they had this concept of the day of the Lord, and as we look at it, it starts with judgment, deliverance, and then conversion of the nations. However, what was new, and we touched upon this last time, what was really new in the minds of first century Jews and Judaism, and what had been developing prior to that, it had been developing in what we call the intertestament period, right? Those years between the writing of the completion of the Hebrew scriptures and the writing of the New Covenant scriptures. What was new and what had began to be developed in that time, so by the time you get to Matthew 1, is this, and this had developed in the minds of the Pharisees, which my understanding were more of a political entity about 150 years before Yeshua lived, and developed more into a religious entity. And the new thing about this sect, as opposed to the Sadducees or the Tzaddikim, the priesthood, was that one could obtain prominence by intellectual study or by knowledge and that kind of thing. And the Pharisees, in my understanding, were a disproportionate group. They weren't as many in numbers, and yet their influence carried on to this day, because the modern rabbis are a result of the first century Pharisaic understanding. The Pharisees, according to my understanding still, began this idea of the tradition of the elders, and so they had this idea that along with the written Torah, there was this body of oral transmission. But, and I think I'm correct in this because I was researching it, they didn't come up with in other words, they had this body of oral tradition that they used, they relied on just as much as the Torah. But the idea that originated on Mount Sinai didn't start with the Pharisees, but later, I think it was the Tananim, or what we call the rabbis today. So years later, the rabbis looked back and began to say, no, this tradition of the elders that began with the Pharisees originated on Sinai. There's no evidence that the Pharisees ever said that originated on Sinai. Why would the Jewish people today say that the oral law, what we call Talmud, originated on Mount Sinai?
Legitimacy?
Yeah, that's it. If it originated on Sinai, it has the same weight, even if not more, because it's kind of as the written Torah. And that's solely the property of the rabbis today, because you get to read Hebrew and everything and research it. So, but anyway, but all that to say, got off on a tangent there. What was new in the first century was, and what had developed in the intertestamental period and in the minds of the Pharisees, is that kind of a renewed desire now begins to spring up under Roman oppression for this day of the Lord to come. If you ever wanted this day to come, this was it, right? This was the perfect storm for this time to come, with this awesome judgment and overthrow of the nations and Rome. And in addition to that, so this was now kind of more fully developed in the minds of the Pharisees, and then later became the rabbis. And in addition, the idea begins to enter their minds that, hey, maybe we can do something about this. Maybe we can play a part, which is not really anti-biblical. I mean, Peter says that we hasten the day of the Lord. So there's something, I think God, we do play a part. So this is not complete, but they began to think more and more that how can we help God out? How can we do something to kind of move things to their climax, in history, and move things to this event in history called the day of the Lord. And as we said, this was the perfect storm because the Roman Empire was looked upon as just that kind of perfect situation of oppression and just that perfect situation of the awesome power, as an empire that would be the backdrop for the most awesome deliverance in history. So this was all. I mean, if you could be conditioned for something, I think first century Jewish minds were fully conditioned to see Yeshua solely within the political frame and not so much within his atoning forgiveness and sin frame. So what happened, now we come into the New Testament period, and we have the names of these four kind of religious groups, right? We talked a little bit, and we are dealing with these. So these various groups now want to play a role in moving history to this thing called the Day of the Lord. And we're dealing here with three prominent parties in the pages of the New Testament. And these parties are proactive. They are pro-gung-ho about moving history to these events. We're going to disregard the Sadducees or the Tzaddikim, those who come from the tribe of Zadok, the priesthood, because they had, by the time of Yeshua arrives on the scene, they were pretty corrupt. They were pretty sold out to the Romans. And that's why I say Hanukkah was kind of confusing, because what started out good didn't end too good. So when it says that Yeshua, it was in John, Yeshua, it was the feast of dedication. Chanukah comes from Chanak, which means to train up or dedicate. That's why we train up a child, we dedicate a child. We allow them to see the dedication of the generations that have come before them. But when Yeshua, it says it was Hanukkah, and Yeshua walked on Solomon's porch, and I think what was going on there, I mean, I think he was thinking about Hanukkah, and I think they were thinking about Hanukkah, but Hanukkah was confusing. Hanukkah wasn't at that time, what began, the leaders, the Hasmoneans, moved into territories that were not their jurisdiction. They wanted to take back the government, but that wasn't their role. But now you have the right individual from the right tribe to take back the government. And because the Sadducees had become corrupt, they were sold out. They were the party of might, M-I-G-H-T. You could look at it if you want to just like use a few little memoric devices or things. So when Yeshua was there on Hanukkah, I think that the idea was that now he's the one that's going to really take back the government, not the Hasmoneans. They stepped into areas that were not their right to do. They rededicated the temple. That's good, but then they began to move into the areas of taking back the government. And they shouldn't have done that. So now they're looking at Yeshua with Hanukkah hope, in a sense, with real the fulfillment of what Hanukkah was. Because if you strip everything away from Hanukkah, you could say that Hanukkah is about taking back the government, the true government. Yeshua sitting on the throne of David. The Hasmoneans couldn't sit on the throne of David. That's why it started to be a little bit confusing. But now you've got the right guy, and they're looking at him with all the hope of Hanukkah. They're looking at him to take back the government, and so that's what's kind of going on. But anyway, so the Sadducees are kind of out of the picture, but we're left with the Pharisees, and we said that the Sadducees would be the might group, right? They're the might because they were in cahoots with the Romans, and they were the aristocrats of that day. They had the power, they had the authority, the might group. We could say that the Pharisees would be the right group, R-I-G-H-T. They would be the right group because as bad as the Pharisee, we kind of dump on the Pharisees, but the Pharisees, we said, were closer theologically to Yeshua than any of the other sects. So they were the right group, except they had this issue with the oral law. But Yeshua argued more with the Pharisees. He interacted more with the Pharisees than other groups. The Essenes, you could say, the flight group. They were like the super purists, like the super duper purists, right? They went out into these monastic communities. So they were the flight group. And then you have finally the zealots, which were the fight group, F-I-G-H-C. So you have the might group, the right group, the flight group, and the fight group. We said the Sadducees were not included because they were opposed to change. Why would they want anything to change? They had it made. They were, kind of in cahoots with the Romans to find favor. They opposed any political or religious change. They were the status quo party, right? They had nothing to gain by things changing. But I want to say too, and we said this earlier, that within Orthodoxy today, Jewish people still think this way. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, with regard to programs that move history to the coming of Messiah, particularly in Hasidism and Hasidic Judaism. Judaism in general is a bit weary of this because of these historic programs that have led to great disaster. But Hasidic Jews still talk that way, as far as I know, and still believe that living in a particular way hastens history to the coming of Messiah. Not your Messiah, not the Messiah, but their Messiah, which is they have a very specific plan to bring back their Messiah. It's not a heavenly one. No, he's an anointed king. Anointed simply means he's an Orthodox Jewish person. And king simply means he's the head of the Knesset. He's the head of the Israeli government. And that guy, and they have a specific plan to bring in a guy like that. And interestingly, they will probably embrace that person, this according to Scripture tells us, and they will probably look at him, and he will accomplish a few things. When you look at biblical prophecy, he might accomplish a season of peace in the Middle East, right? He will convert secular Jews to Orthodox Judaism. And he probably will build the temple to some degree or be behind it. If that's part of your eschatology, I think there's very good reason to think that there will be a temple built again. I'm not talking about in the by and by, I'm talking about here before the Lord returns. And they will look at him and they will say, gee, he brought peace to the Middle East. He built the temple. He converted secular Jews en masse. To not to salvation, to Orthodox Jewry. And they'll say, well, why do we need Yeshua? Yeshua didn't do any of those things. Our guy did all three of those things. You can see how things can be set up for the coming. But we got a little off track. But we're dealing with, and we'll close with this part, we're dealing with 3 first-century parties that wanted to move history to the coming of Messiah. And the Pharisaism, believed that the way to do that was to develop the purity laws, right? So they were the party that wanted to develop the purity and holiness laws, and which were for the priests. I mean, there were certain regulations of purity and ways of life and laws that the priests were to live by, but that was not given to the nation, to the peoples. It wasn't given to the Haaretz. It wasn't given to the people of the land, the average Israeli of that day. So, and their call was the Pharisee. The Pharisee said, "Well, look, we will move history to its climax. We will move history to this concept of the day of the Lord, where God's going to judge but deliver us by becoming so pure and so holy that God will have to come. He will be obligated to come and deliver us from the Romans." And Phariseeism understood this holiness in 2 ways. First, by living by the written Torah for sure, but also by living according to what they call the tradition of the elders, or what in the New Testament is called, which primarily had to do with temple purity laws, ceremonial washings, and things of that nature, that they were now imposing on the average person of that, the average Israeli, like the disciples. So you get to the New Testament, and there's this debate between Yeshua and the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 15 and Mark 7, and he says, "How come your disciples are eating their bread with impure hands and not according to the tradition of the elders?" That tradition of the elders was part of the oral law that was circulating. It didn't start at Sinai, But it began most likely in the days of Ezra, and there was a body of oral law of some kind that was circulating in the first century, and they were appealing to that. And this is, how come your disciples are eating their bread with impure hands and not according to the tradition of the elders? And so the Pharisees charge Yeshua, right? And this is, how could he be the Messiah? You know, he's breaking the law. He's breaking this oral fence around the law, right? And in the debate, they're not talking about ham sandwiches or lobster, but they're referring to this ritual cleansing that was performed before eating food. And of course, so their disciples were not doing that, and they were upset with them. So of course, this came from the priesthood, right? Because priests were not to do certain things. They were not to touch dead bodies. They were to have a high level of purity, right? Anything, even in the slightest way that would compromise that, would disqualify them from their priesthood or priestly duties. And so the idea was, we're going to make the whole nation like them. I mean, that's what we're going to do, right? Think of how huge a program that was. I mean, these guys, they started out on this program that was just, monumentous. I mean, to get the whole nation to do that. The Essenes, just quickly, they were kind of like the ultra purists. They didn't want to associate with anyone else. The Essenes saw even the Pharisees, as high standards as they had, they saw them as compromising with the Romans. They saw the temple was so corrupt, and so they withdrew. They went out into the desert, into these monastic communities. And we can see Yeshua as somewhat between the Pharisees, in a sense, and the Essenes. He didn't compromise with the temple system as the Pharisees did, and yet he didn't break away from the people. He didn't isolate himself from the people, but in fact tried to change it, right? But the Essenes believed that if they were to become part of these monastic communities and become super duper pure, not like these guys, God will come and deliver us. And theirs was it had a very limited end time hope, because it reminds me of the modern day dispensationalist scheme, where only a very few are saved, and yet the prophets speak of the knowledge of God really going out in that last generation, But theirs was an eschatological program too, just like the Pharisees, but it was very limited. They saw them like us four, no more, shut the door kind of thing. They believed that only a very small few would be saved, the rest will be destroyed. The Zealots, and we'll just close with this. The Zealots, on the other hand, were the practically minded, militaristic kind of rebel program. Simon Peter, cut off the servant's ear, coming from that zealot kind of mindset. They were no less spiritual than the Pharisees or the Essenes. They just had a different program. They believed history has come to the place where it looks like the prophets of old, and that practically they had to do something about it. I mean, they had to take matters into their own hands, and what we have to do, they said, is not be engaged in all these purity laws. That's not going to do it, right? That the Pharisees, the Essenes were doing. Well, we need to raise up an army, right? We need to raise up an army and come against Rome. And if we will just do that, if we will just take that initiative, certainly the Messiah will see us and he'll put us over the top. And so you have these. So let me just close with this question, and we'll pick this up, because we're going to move further into the New Testament and into the book of Acts. That's where we want to end up, in the book of Acts. I know, like, David is going to be going through the book of Acts. Which one of these three groups, in a sense, kind of won out in terms of successfully marketing their program, if you think about it? Now, in a way, it's kind of a double, because what has generated out of the Pharisaic mindset is the rabbinic Judaism today. So, in one sense, you could say that has continued. But what out of these programs, what is the one that really won out practically? What in terms of marketing their program? Yeah. Is it a multiple choice?
I was thinking the Essenes would have put the Bible together, but actually it was Nicaea, correct?
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but I mean, like, maybe I'm not wording it. Okay, what happened in 70 A.D. and 135 A.D.?
Zealots lost.
The Zealots lost, but the Zealot as a program marketed it. That's the way they went. They raised up an army, and they went and of course Yeshua wasn't in it. I mean that wasn't his program, and that's why I'm saying so on a practical level they marketed the nation went to war with the Romans, and God was not in it. Not in it at all. When he comes back, he's going to be in it. but it went that direction, and you can just see, like, how disillusioning this is. So it was. You see how hard it would have been even for Yeshua, the Lord God. I mean, to try to break in and he began these great parables, Matthew 13 about the kingdom and how this mystery form of the kingdom would play out. The wheat and the tares, the mustard seed, all this was the seed, that 4 types of soil. All this was trying to communicate to these guys, like, I'm here, and the kingdom really is here, but it's here in this kind of already not yet kind of way. And it was very difficult for him to, and those guys didn't get it until later and later. But I'm just saying, like they were so steeped in their own eschatology, in their own ways, their own programs, that it must have been, like, insanely difficult for the Lord to kind of break in to these guys and say, look, you kind of got it, but you don't got it, and over here you're wrong, you're right over here, and just how it developed. And so,
Even today,
yeah.
how it's evolved into this even more secularized, worldly way of thinking.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, I don't want to go too much, but the next time we get together, we will look at some of the background. We'll finish a little more with the background of the New Testament, and then how Yeshua accommodates this, how he does, and then we'll kind of move into the book of Acts and show that the Abrahamic covenant really was something that the Jewish people, their calling in life was to be a blessing to the nations. In you shall all the nations be blessed. And yet they end up fulfilling that. Israel had a job description. And when the kingdom came in its partial form, the call of the Abrahamic covenant began to be fulfilled, because remember, the call on Israel was to be a light to be a blessing to the nations. And they failed in that. But now, with the coming of the new covenant, and covenants are always ratified by death and blood, Yeshua dies. His life is now lived in and through. He is Israel representative. And the life of Israel is recapitulated in the life of the Jewish people in the first century. And he now lives his life through them. And they go out in the first 10 chapters, 11 chapter 12 in the book of Acts, and they now bless the nations, right? They bless the nations because they're now taking up that call to be an instrument of the nations coming to the knowledge of God. So you can see how relevant the Abrahamic covenant is still, and of course, the Abrahamic covenant is we were saying this in a different class. It makes up the primary. It's the Abrahamic covenant is central to the plan of God. It makes up the major themes of the Old Testament, and it's just like the nations come. So I'll close with this. This is not part of this course, but God's 3 promises to Abraham. Remember, the land that has not been fulfilled yet. Okay, Abraham says, "I'll give you a land," because Israel has not possessed their land in permanence, peace, and safety. The prophets speak repeatedly of the time when Israel will dwell in security. So the Abrahamic covenant is still relevant today. It comes. There's great continuity. It goes into the new covenant. Second, God will make a great nation and a great name. The prediction that day will come when all of Israel is righteous or saved. You can't have a great nation and be a wicked nation at the same time. So Israel coming into that place of greatness means that she will be holy or saved. That hasn't happened yet. Israel is a secular nation, right? So the Abrahamic covenant is relevant. It makes up the major themes of the Old Testament. It's part of the central part of the plan of God, and it has relevance to the whole earth. And finally, all the families of the earth, the nations, Gentiles, are worshiping the God of Israel. That hasn't happened yet. We have representation, right? But we don't have it in its fullness. And so I know we kind of got off on that, but when the disciples went out in the book of Acts, they were living out that place of being an instrument of the nations coming to God, and that was what goes all the way back to the Abrahamic covenant. And so they go out, and so that is the Abrahamic covenant. You can see the great continuity in the Bible. You know, the Hebrew scriptures, we come into the new covenant, right? It's a great continuity. So the Abrahamic covenant is central to the plan of God for the end days. It makes up the major themes of the Old Testament prophets, because prophets speak about those three things: the nations coming to light, Israel coming into her election, and the land. So that's what we have for today. So sure, you're welcome. And then tomorrow we'll look at it a little bit more. Okay, well, blessings.